is that you will lose 2/3 of your purchasing power over 10 years. Now, that arithmetic is stark. It's truly stark.
So my first question is, how many years of economics do you believe it took for Joe Biden to put together that mathematical equation on the $3.5 trillion package, that $3.5 trillion equals zero? Did that add up with what you were thinking on the math?
Obviously government people who spend money do math differently than people who provide the money that they spend. I would suggest to you that the taxpayers probably have a better sense of arithmetic than the administration does. That notwithstanding, Jake, I continue to be amazed that the voters tend to believe that you can add a column of negative numbers, which is to say deficits, and come up with a positive sum. The idea that you can service $150 trillion in on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet liabilities at the federal level, with a budget that's in deficit between $3 and $6 trillion, as you suggest, implies a willful lack of knowledge about either economics or arithmetic. I must say it suggests a very good grasp of politics, in the sense that Mr. Biden and his cronies have found a way to bribe almost every constituency that they possibly could using other people's money. It reminds me, Jake, frankly, of that old sort of wag about you can understand the process of politics by examining the root words, poly from the Latin for many, and tick from the English colloquial for small blood-sucking insects. This is certainly a political bill. It makes no sense from an economic perspective. It makes no sense from an arithmetic perspective, but it makes all kinds of sense from a political perspective.
Yeah, speaking of words, in George Orwell's book, 1984, when he's talking about this world that they're building, that basically they're going to redefine words. And while I was watching them say that, I used to kind of get upset, like a little worried about what's happening. At this point, I'm just thoroughly entertained, because when I see half a dozen people go on television and say $3.5 trillion out of thin air that's borrowed from the Federal Reserve that printed it out of nothing, then gave it to us at debt equals zero, I just burst out laughing. And I want to know, what do you think are the ramifications of this, and why does 3.5 trillion not equal zero?
Well, let's go back to your definitions. They would define that as quantitative easing. That's their language. I would define it as counterfeiting. I think my use of English is proper, and their use of English is obfuscatory. That's a good word for them. As you suggest, the ramifications of counterfeiting $3.5 trillion on top of that which they've already counterfeited is, at least over time, debasing the currency. And at some point in time, and I can't say when this is, arithmetic certainly overwhelms narrative, and they'll have a problem then. It would appear that the political class is less concerned about having a problem then than having a problem now. And so, to the extent, and by the way, this is a well-trodden path in government. It was tried in Weimar Germany. It ended up, of course, with the election of Hitler. It was perfected probably by Gideon Gono in Zimbabwe.
Oh, was that the president during that time?
No, it was the finance minister.
Okay.
It was somebody who was more efficient at bad math than the president, who was merely a murderous thug. It is also being tried in Venezuela. So you can see how this ends. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the US at present resembles Venezuela. I'm only suggesting that if you spend more money than you have, ultimately what you do is you debase the currency. And I think that's precisely what's happening. At present, it would seem like there are various constituencies of voters, many of whom are not taxpayers, that like the circumstance that you get to consume now a range of government goods and services and pay later, and probably somebody else pays later. For your listeners who are overwhelmingly producers and savers, this is a very bad circumstance. Whether or not it's a bad circumstance that causes them to have a negative outcome in the near term or the longer term is something I'm not prepared to count on. But we've talked before on air, you and I, about two different words, one being inevitable and the other being imminent. The fact is that deficit spending on this order of magnitude and debt and deficits, which is a different problem, never, ever arithmetically has a happy ending. Whether the threat is imminent is something I can't tell you, but the fact that the threat is inevitable is certainly something I can tell you.
So what are the ramifications of printing money like this? You said that Weimar Germany, which many know is kind of one of the more historic examples of hyperinflation. And then you said on the other side of it, they elected Hitler. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate for someone that, they say, hey, look, this system's unfair and I need my money too at this point. And so they should keep printing it. And then there's people like Ron Paul that have warned for many years that this is a hidden tax that actually makes people more poor. And I was just wondering, could you elaborate for someone that, maybe they agree with you, they don't really trust government, they're on the same page, but maybe they're not doing that well financially, maybe they lost their job, so they're saying, hey, keep printing the money, this is better than nothing. What are the real long-term social ramifications of doing this type of experiment?
That's a great question, Jake. And I want to disclaim the fact that I'm not an economist. I'm a credit analyst first. But I would say that the real ramification is that it postpones a reckoning. And if you postpone a reckoning, you almost always have to pay back with interest. So the fact that you were able to skate through today and tomorrow and the day after on other people's money means that ultimately, when society itself has to pay the bill is much, much, much larger. For the first 10 years of Weimar Germany, nobody noticed what was happening except that the prices of goods and services increased. And as the price of goods and services increased, the demands on the Commonwealth by those who couldn't keep up with the increases grew and grew and grew. And the consequence of that is that the people who were dependent on the system became more dependent on the system until the system simply couldn't stand the demands that were placed upon it. Now, for a different class of people, a class of people who are savers, the circumstance that is in front of us now is desperate. If you are a saver during a period of inflation, printing, and artificially low interest rates at once, the arithmetic is really depressing. Let's say, Jake, this doesn't apply to you perhaps, but to some of your older listeners, the world's benchmark savings instrument is the US 10-year Treasury. At present, it yields 125 basis points, 1.25%. So you give the US federal government money for 10 years and they pay you 1.25% on it. The problem with that is that according to US government statistics, inflation, or the depreciation of the purchasing power of the currency, is growing at 5.5%. So you are losing 4.25% every year for 10 years, which means cumulatively and compounded over 10 years, you have lost 65% of your purchasing power in an allegedly riskless instrument.
Wow.
Think about that. You are trying to do the right thing. You've worked, you've saved for your retirement, or you saved to afford something, and you've tried to save in what is allegedly the least risky savings instrument in the world, the US 10-year Treasury. And as a consequence of you for living your life correctly, saving, forestalling consumption, the value proposition is that you will lose 2/3 of your purchasing power over 10 years. Now, that arithmetic is stark. It's truly stark.